Okay, when I left you on Friday, the French had entered into Mexico. The excuse for this invasion of Mexico was that Benito Juarez, the president of Mexico, had stopped paying interest on money that was owed the French. So Napoleon III uses this to persuade, at least for a brief time, the British and the Spanish to join the French army in invading Mexico to force Juarez to pay for this debt. Very quickly, the Spanish and the French decide that this is a mistake, and they cut a deal with the Mexican government, and they leave. And as I said on Friday, what Napoleon III, what his whole scheme was, he didn't care about the money that Mexico owed France. I mean, he cared about it, but it wasn't that big a deal. But he had a plot in mind. He was going to overthrow the Republic of Mexico, and he was going to overthrow Benito Juarez, the president of Mexico, and he was going to put in the place of Benito Juarez, he was going to put in an emperor in Mexico, a European emperor, Maximilian of Austria, who was his puppet. This is really a French show. Maximilian was from Austria, and there were a small number of Austrian troops in France, but this was really all Napoleon III's idea. It was his show. It was the French army was running the show. One of the ways you might want to think about this is Maximilian was Napoleon's puppet. He basically did what the French told him to do. Okay, so this all happens in early 1862, and as I went to great length to explain last Friday, what allowed Napoleon III to do this was the Civil War. Because if there had been no Civil War, the United States would not have allowed the French to go into Mexico, to invade Mexico, and especially to put in a king in Mexico, a monarch in Mexico. But Lincoln's hands were tied during the Civil War. Or so he said. The Monroe Doctrine, which had warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, was no longer in play during the Civil War because the U.S. was involved in a death match with the Confederacy, trying to unify the Union and make the United States whole again. And as I talked about on Friday as well, the Confederates looked the other way. In fact, they signaled to Napoleon III that it was okay with them if the French put in a emperor into Mexico. And they didn't care about the Monroe Doctrine either. Now, the Lincoln government opposes very strenuously what Napoleon III is doing, but they just feel like their hand is tied, at least until the war is over. That the United States is in no position to go to war with France at this point. Also, I think a lot of Americans, especially the Secretary of State William Seward, he just thought the French had made a huge mistake. Not to sound like Donald Trump there for a second. That the French had made a major mistake by intervening into Mexico, that they had bitten off more than they could chew. And when you're thinking about the French intervention in Mexico, you might want to think about when the Russians went into Afghanistan in the late 1980s, which was an event that actually led to the fall of the Soviet Empire. That would be a good analogy. But so many Americans were confident in Washington that the French were going to be defeated. But even so, they refused to sell the Mexican government guns because they didn't want to provoke the French. And also they said, look, if we do this, if the United States comes in and is seen as the government that overthrows the French or kicks the French out, that this could be a bad thing for the Mexican people, that the Mexicans have to do it on their own. So anyway, long story short, the French go into Mexico in early 1862, and they march towards Mexico City. And on May 5th, 1862, surprisingly, shockingly for everybody, except for maybe perhaps Benito Juarez and the Republicans in Mexico, the French army is checked at the Battle of Puebla. At the Battle of Puebla, the French army is defeated when they try to capture Puebla. And Puebla, the significance of Puebla is that if an army can take Puebla, it opens the door for Mexico City. So the Battle of Puebla, the first one on May 5th, 1862, it's really about Mexico City. If the French capture Puebla, they're going to capture Mexico City. But they don't capture Puebla, at least at this point. They're defeated, which stuns everybody, stuns the world. And there's an interesting story about the general who defeated the French, and it kind of ties into this whole larger story I'm talking about when I'm talking about the connections between the Civil War and the French intervention, and how these two events were part of a larger kind of global struggle. But let me talk about the local connections first. So the Mexican general that defeated the French was a guy by the name of Ignacio Zaragoza. And Zaragoza was a brilliant general. He was young. Tragically, he dies very quickly after the First Battle of Puebla, May 5th. I think he dies of typhoid fever or something like that. So, and he's a national hero in Mexico to this very day. And I'll show you, I think this is a 50 peso note, which has Zaragoza's image on it. And so Zaragoza, a national hero in Mexico, apparently, and some of you all in the class that are more familiar with Mexico than I am, Cinco de Mayo is not really a big deal in Mexico. It's a much bigger deal in the United States. It's an excuse for people to drink. But it's a very significant date. And let me talk about Zaragoza. What's interesting about Zaragoza is that he was actually born in Texas in 1829 when Texas was part of Mexico. His father was a member of the Mexican army, and his mother was a Seguin, and a relative of Juan Seguin. And actually, Zaragoza's mother and father married in San Antonio in the 1820s, when again San Antonio was still part of Mexico. So what's very interesting is that one of the great national heroes of Mexico, Ignacio Zaragoza, is a figure that was actually born in Goliad, Texas, in the late 1820s, because his father was stationed there. And then, of course, with the Mexican-American War, the borders change, and the Rio Grande becomes the border south of Goliad. But I always think it's just very, very interesting that the national hero of Mexico, and you see statues of Zaragoza all over Mexico, was born in Texas. His mother was a Seguin. And here's the other significant aspect of it, and really more salient to the Civil War course. I argue in some articles that I've written that Cinco de Mayo is a significant victory for the Union Army, because and Abraham Lincoln, because in checking the French were very sympathetic to the Confederate government. There was a lot of talk that the French might recognize the Confederate government, although they never do. But the French certainly are sympathetic to the Confederacy, if for no other reason. Napoleon III thinks it's important that the Confederacy wins because he wants a buffer between the United States and Mexico, which the Confederate States of America would have been that buffer if the Confederacy had won. So you can make a good argument, and we'll never know for sure because it didn't happen. This is what we call counterfactuals as historians, that Cinco de Mayo was a significant victory for the Lincoln administration because it stopped the French in 1862 from taking Mexico City, which they would have done very quickly had not Zaragoza defeated them. And we know this because what happens the next year, the French what they do is they regroup, they reinforce their army, they build the French army in Mexico to about 35,000 men. The reason it had been so much smaller in 1862 is Napoleon III was convinced that the Mexicans were going to welcome him with open arms, and he was shocked to discover that they were not going to do that at all. Most Mexicans, anyway, they were very supportive of Juarez. You do have a small group of Mexican conservatives that do collaborate with Napoleon III, but I think it's fair to say that the bulk of the Mexican people are very, very supportive of Juarez and despise the French. So had the French taken over Mexico City in 1862, well, so this is the next year, this is what happens. And they take Puebla in May of 1863, almost exactly a year later after Cinco de Mayo. And then in June of 1863, they capture Mexico City. So we know what happened the next year, and we can assume that that would have happened in 1862. And so if this had happened in 1862, if the French had been able to capture Mexico City in 1862, well, remember, this would have been 6 months before the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, although I don't think that would have made a big difference in Lincoln's decision. But what it would have done, it would have allowed the French to start working with the Confederates at a time when the Civil War was still going very, very poorly for the United States. Now, when the French do capture Mexico City, it's just a couple of weeks before Gettysburg, it's just a couple of weeks before Vicksburg. And although the Union Army, there's still a lot of fighting after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Union Army, pretty much from a military point of view, does hold the upper hand. And so if the French had captured Mexico City in 1862, they could have helped the Confederacy, and I'm not talking about militarily. I doubt if the French would have ever sent troops into the Confederacy, but they could have sent arms to the Confederacy. They could have supplied all kinds of moral support to the Confederacy from the South. They could have sent numerous other supplies from Mexico into the Confederacy, and they could have really made a big difference in Texas and in the whole Western theater of the Confederacy had they taken Mexico City in 1862. The key point is they don't. And it's because of Zaragoza. It's because of the bravery of the Wallista army, the Republican army in Mexico. So when the French finally do take Mexico City in 1863, the Civil War is at a completely different stage than it was a year earlier. So again, and I'm going back to this idea of the connections between the Civil War and the French intervention. I think you can make a good argument, and I think I have made a good argument in some articles that I've written, that Cinco de Mayo was a major victory for the Union Army. It was a major victory for Abraham Lincoln and for the Union cause in ways that historians have not really understood until fairly recently.